Thank you, Loy, for joining the DR Pioneers interview. I was wondering, how did you initially get engaged in DRR work back in India, I presume?
Yes, well back in India. In fact, as an engineering student, I became involved in various social causes. And in my first job in 1981, as a young engineer who joined a manufacturing company in Pune, after 2 years of supervising the production line and also doing some maintenance work, I moved into the industrial safety department and did a 1-year course on the subject and actively promoted industrial safety, did safety inspections and audits, and trained workers, their supervisors and managers to work safely and rectify unsafe industrial systems. In my spare time, I also became involved socially in the Audyogik Jeevan Manch, which is a Hindi word for industrial life platform in Pune, and the trade union-led Occupational Health and Safety Centre in Mumbai, led by trade unionists from Blue Star. The catastrophic disaster in Bhopal in 1984 was a turning point in my life. It reinforced my selection, which had of a profession which I had started even before, and it was in the years to come. That means by 1986, India had for the first time an Environmental Protection Act, and within that, a number of thematic areas related to environmental protection. I started working in the National Safety Council of India, leaving industry, and moved to Mumbai and worked for 10 years there, 1986 to 1996. And I actively trained managers, supervisors, and workers, did safety audits, promoted awareness campaigns across the country, and organized national and international occupational health and safety conferences. In India, we began working on a 4-country program. That means it was not in India. I was working only in the India program, but the focus was on doing disaster preparedness at the area level, both in industrial units, but more importantly at the area level, in 6 different locations in the country, working with industry, regulatory authorities, including the Factories Inspectorate and the Environmental Protection, the Pollution Control Boards, the emergency response agencies, both hospitals and fire services, and communities, including their representatives. The district collector took the lead in the response, and she played, and the inspectorate, who was focusing on chemical disaster prevention and preparedness, promoted effective collaborative response. So this work began around 1992. When the Latur earthquake happened in September 1993, and this was in my home state, of course, I lived it at a great distance, but we felt the shaking in Mumbai. And I had an employee in our house who was from the area, affected area. I became a bit exposed to so-called natural hazards and started interacting with ADPC. But by 1996, I moved there and started working on both natural or unnatural disasters coupled with industrial disasters. Bangkok, Thailand became my home or my base for the next 15 years. And I joined in the 10th year of its existence. I really became involved in disaster preparedness and reduction at ADPC, primarily in the learning or teaching and professional development department, and later in national and regional program development and delivery. We developed partnerships with communities, subnational authorities, especially at the state or the province level, and also national governments, both the regulatory agencies as well as others. And I worked full-time at ADPC from 1996 to 2011, participating in sectoral development as well as various sectors in the countries of the region, over 20 countries more actively.
Loy, you also worked around urban disaster in the urban disaster mitigation program. Was this a new topic at the time to focus more on urban areas than on the traditional rural context, or how did that come about?
Okay. When I joined ADPC, actually we used some funding available from the AUDMP to fund my position. But I was also responsible for the training department, which focused on the DMC, which I ran 3 courses, and it will soon complete its 50th iteration. So 50 courses have been run by the DMC, and with the newly introduced CBDRM. But I focused for a significant amount of my time in our AUDMP and was responsible for its training, resource material, and continuing education component. We developed a generic course on urban disaster mitigation, and trained people from cities. This was drawn from initially 8 and later 10 countries, and as well as specialized courses which were hazard specific. So UFM, urban flood mitigation, the earthquake risk mitigation for cities, ERMC, or actually I think we called it earthquake vulnerability, EVRC. So earthquake vulnerability reduction for cities, then the cyclone risk mitigation program, and given my background, I advocated for and later got a separate program on technological risk mitigation for cities. So this thematically, in terms of a focus of work on cities, was a new area. It was funded by USAID. It was the first major program consistent for a long term, which was implemented. And I pay tribute to David Hollister, who is no more, who really pioneered that program. In each of the courses, we developed, we got both practitioners and experts and developed regionally and nationally, national partner training institutions. That is existing institutions. We didn't create new institutions, but we engaged existing partner institutions and really pioneered the city level partnerships and program building in about 20 to 25 cities in 10 Asian countries. In some senses, it was pioneering, and later, this was delivered over the period 1995 to 2004. Not by, Dave was consistently involved right up to the very end. This was the basis for what ISDR started and which grew to its Making Cities Resilient campaign, in which today we have around 4,300 cities, which partnering with UN Habitat. And you can see the handbook here, the cities handbook.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, the second program, which also drew inspiration, was the 100 Resilient Cities program of the Rockefeller Foundation. And they had more money. They focused on cities which were in the so-called developed countries. And even today, though they intended to continue, it is pioneering and taking off. And there is a new partnership that has now been widened and established called the MCR 2030 program. So I think we can see definitely a significant contribution from the small program that we started, not so small, but meaningful. Now, key lessons which I learned were that new legal responsibilities are not enough. We need to, in the case of India, and this is a lesson I drew from my work in India, we need to partner with government response mechanisms, industry, response capacity institutions, regulatory agencies who have to play a new role as facilitators, and sometimes that's challenging, and building multi-institutional preparedness and response capacities, periodically rehearsing it, and maintaining the new institutional mechanisms and collaborations up to date. This was a challenge, but it's a key need. So too, when in the AUDMP program, working with training institutions, there's strengths and limitations, the importance of building partnerships with city government, subnational administrations, and response agencies, and establishing national coalitions which are not internationally funded, which can sustain and preferably be nationally funded, is another key lesson that I learned. In terms of mainstreaming, and we talk of mainstreaming of gender, we talk of mainstreaming of disaster reduction into development. It is important and crucial to involve the sectoral planning and finance agencies and ally with the NDMOs and implement pilot programs so that new development programs automatically start embracing resilience as one of the themes. This is something we advocate today, but the core of it was piloted in that period. Some of the challenges, let me talk about some of the challenges. So there is huge work that needs to be done, and the more infrequent the hazard, the less the investment in this effort, this kind of effort. So key challenges are common with other disaster management work. Unfortunately, attention and resources flow when highly visible disasters strike, and the money and voluntary support comes early and easily at the time, particularly in the first month. Later investment is also there in reconstruction, particularly when the banks are investing in reconstruction and building back better, and using well-framed post-disaster assessments. So I think I have a copy of, anyway, I don't want to focus on that. But resources for investment in preparedness, resources for investment in risk reduction, and continuing to invest in and support resilience building, this is completely underinvested. I mean, I don't want to criticize this, but in my view, far greater investment needs to be done there compared to what is actually being done. And it's not only the international donor agencies. We must focus on the investments that are possible from national budgets and are needed from national budgets. After all, the government, this is an integral part of the government, and the government has to spend. And we have seen it in India also. What started out as a UNDP, Government of India program, has now grown into state government funded programs. And of course, they still look for external money, but there is meaningful investment, not adequate enough, but meaningful investment by the national government. And this is an effort gradually spreading to other countries, including the Philippines and Indonesia, where I've seen Vietnam, where we have seen positive work. So there is really a need to tackle and fix the tussle between humanitarian responders and proponents of mitigation and reduction. More importantly, or equally importantly, there is need to value and recognize, I think I've already spoken of this, the good government work which is done. And we must continue it, we must expand it, we must routinize it. Two other weaknesses I'll speak about. One is we do not invest enough in volunteer work. So we need to promote volunteer action, fund it, support it. And I mean, the Red Cross is a good example of it. But there are other sectors that need to expand, and we need to visibilize and increase volunteer action, not just post-disaster response, but also during peacetime and pre-disaster work. Early warning is a challenge, but unfortunately, one focus among science and technology advocates is to argue for the need to invest in early warning systems and drone technologies. And it is early warning dissemination in the last mile, which is equally, if not more important. So we need to invest much more in dissemination of early warning and in linking it to local level pre-disaster work. So these are some of the lessons that I would draw. And these are weaknesses, continuing weaknesses in our system, which we need to find solutions to. These are not the only weaknesses, but these are weaknesses that I have experienced.
Okay, well, these are also lessons learned in the early days, which you consider still relevant today and not being addressed today, or?
I think they are not yet adequately addressed today. So I mean, I still believe, I'm sorry to say this, but I still believe we are in the early days. We have not yet effectively enough institutionalized preparedness and certainly not mitigation. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done. You see, if we go back to the so-called early days, linking LRRD was the advocacy of the time. And in fact, if we see the 70s and 80s, which is your so-called early days, LRRD was the major slogan, linking relief and recovery to, or linking relief and response to development. And it was a good slogan, but DRR and preparedness investments are supplementary, and we have still not fully harmonized the two. So I believe we are still, unfortunately, in relatively early days.
Okay, and how do you see the field of DRR nowadays? I mean, you're saying like we're still in the early days. Do you feel there's like a linear development, a linear improvement, or are we still stuck in the old challenges? And how does climate change and resilience thinking enrich the DRR thinking, or is it just more of a stumbling block?
Okay. No, I certainly believe that we have effectively advocated for the need for disaster preparedness and risk resilience, including, I mean, we are still grappling with the words, but we are deepening the meaning of the words. So resilience, I strongly support. I recognize the alliance and the alignment between resilience and adaptation. And I see that both of these need to be integral to development. So you see, we are still grappling with, but it's good. It's good that we are grappling. We are not professionally stuck in some, fixated area which we have been trained in and propagating it. What has happened is that the universities that have opened disaster management courses have developed them in various dimensions. There is far more research today on disaster management. A lot of the international money and expenses are spent in some of this work, including research. But this is not enough. We need to lower and routinize some of this and then draw lessons from it, rather than focusing too much on research alone. Because it's through practice that we will get it right, and it will take a long time to get right. So I believe we are still in the early days.
That's an interesting perspective to say that the early days are after 50 years, we're still not really come to a fully mature field, which is being part and parcel of development. That's a really interesting reflection on the field.
There was an article I wrote for Anil Sinha's journal called No Disasters. And I talked of looking backward, looking forward between 1980 and 2030. Not 70, 80 as in the run-up to 1990 IDNDR, and 2030 as towards the targeted end of SDGs. Though I believe we will continue to be doing this work, certainly in the area of climate change and also biodiversity right up to 2050. So, I mean, these are fundamental systemic changes. We may need alignment and reorientation. And I think alliances between climate risk and disaster risk and tackling them is needed, and will be, is not just needed, it is the right way to go.
Some people I interviewed said that we should actually shift from focus on risk reduction to risk creation, they call it. So that development is often contributing, or maldevelopment and maladaptation are often a bigger cost than the corrective approaches that we are taking, and we should focus mainly on these processes to be truly effective. Is this also what your thinking is?
I don't want to put labels, but we need to slow development. This is my view. And in fact, we need to scale back development. We need to become more local, and we need to invest less resources. We need to change lifestyles. We need to slow down what we have got used to in the West. And I mean, there is fundamental change which is needed. And until people become ready to criticize their own patterns of behavior and lifestyles, we will not find appropriate solutions. So, for example, in 1992, we talked of a century, in the Rio, the original Rio conference, we talked of a century of work on environmental protection. And the Rio agenda in 1992 is probably the right agenda. But I would say the SDGs are also in the right direction, because it sees the need for giving some fruits of development, but in a reasonable, pragmatic, and less energy intensive way. So for me, yes, there is maladaptation. There is, I don't want to label these terms, but we need to slow down, reflect on, and reorient a lot of the work which we do.
Okay. Related to that, do you think the pandemic and the slowdown and the lockdown that we have experienced may contribute to that, or will we rush back to normalcy as soon as we are able to do that?
You've probably seen some of my writings on the pandemic, and I have strongly argued for the need. I've pointed out some of the, not benefits of the pandemic, but the positive consequences and the slowing down. I pointed out, and I pointed out the benefits. Unfortunately, I do recognize that we will not institutionalize the slowing down. We are waiting to jump back to normal, and including people like me. So we need to be far more reflective, and this is where academics, as well as leaders and advocates and practitioners, should come together and create a new alliance for slowing down. I mean, I don't want to label or simplify a name, but change the path of development. So those which are, I mean, I would almost coin a term, overdevelopment or maldevelopment or maladaptation. And I don't want to, because we have these practices in all corners of the world, East, West, and the South, where some countries have got used to overdevelopment. So we need to fix that. So, yeah.
Okay. Maybe to conclude the interview, who were your main influences at that time when you started? Who were the people you were inspired by and currently still are inspired by?
Yeah. Okay. You see, I learned a lot from the work which I did on industrial hazards. And I do believe that that work and those lessons have not fully been learned by the people who focus on so-called natural disaster preparedness. And we need a greater integration and alliance between these two. But if I talk about the field of unnatural, natural disaster preparedness, the people who inspired me, and unfortunately the three people I'm going to name are no more with us, but they certainly inspired me and shaped my thinking. And I can add a few more. But Brian Ward, Terry Jegal, David Hollister, whom I worked very closely with, and then the people who were the director of the Cranfield Center, and another person whom I deeply respect. She is with us, fortunately, but she's not active professionally, Shirley Mattingly. I learned a lot from her. Neil Britton, and he has worked in wide and diverse sectors, both in the country, New Zealand, as well as ECTAP and ADB. And I kind of lost touch with him. Amod Dixit, Mel Capistrano, Zendelica, Susan Jose, Manu and Anshu, Indonesian colleagues, Richard Sharp. These are a few of the people whom I learned from, Arkunti and Krishna Pribadi. So, you know, these are the so-called thinkers, but there are also the practitioners. I mean, Mel is an interesting mix of somebody who headed the national NDMO at one point and now works with NGOs. So to his deputy, who is now heading the Climate Change Commission. So, I mean, there are many who have been inspirational figures, and the people from developing countries are not widely enough recognized. So I would advocate that we look at them a lot more seriously. And in fact, the whole effort at creating ADRR or Duryog Nivaran, both of which I'm very familiar with, Peri Peri in Africa, and of course the original RAED in Latin America. These are developing country hubs which have helped lead innovative practice.
Maybe, I mean, link that to ADPC. Was there a close collaboration with these regional initiatives from Bangkok? Did you link up with Elsa? Did you link up with Alan Lavelle and others, or was that a very loose collaboration?
It was a relatively loose collaboration, but Kamal Kishore, Sassani Hegelios, when he was in ADPC, and a third guy went and visited RAED and were inspired by them. This is way back in 97. So, you know, it's late in your period, but early in the early days. I would call them the early days for me. And so what was your question now?
No, whether there was an exchange of learning and capacity building between the different regions. I mean, I heard like Ian Day and Cranfield was a very important place, like at the global level, because lots of people I've interviewed said that they benefited a lot from these trainings. But at the same time, there was a need for kind of regionalization of training efforts and contextualization as well. And I was wondering whether there was any learning from Asia with Latin America, or whether Africa was somehow also exposed to some of your material, or was it still kind of locked up in
I'll answer. So you see, I think Latin America was the pioneer. Okay, so RAED probably, in fact, your early 70s is probably the work of RAED. Asia, the work, ADPC was formed only in 1986. And that was early days. We focused on training and capacity building initially. And I was not present at the time, but I am familiar enough with that history. And it was, I hate to use the word because you're also a Westerner, but I will use it. It was a lot of Western education in the Asian context. And it took another 10 years before. Today, there's a predominance of Asian leadership in ADPC. Africa, the Cranfield Disaster Management Center was based in the UK. assisting Africa. And it took decades before indigenous organizations in Africa got developed. And of course, South Africa, DeWald, is doing some good work. So Africa, really the turning point was 2000. And I would relate, let's say, early 80s, late 80s as the turning point in Asia. But new institutions at the national level coming from the period of 2000-2005.
Okay, thanks, Loy, for a very interesting interview. Is there anything else you would like to convey to us, or something you didn't manage to tell? Otherwise, I'd like to thank you and say how inspirational you yourself have been to many younger researchers and practitioners, thanks to your efforts. And it's amazing if I see your CV and all your engagements. I think you've been very influential yourself during your 30 or 40-year career now, and I wish you very well.
The only comment I'll make is that at the so-called end of the 30 or 40-year career, I am more activist. I go back to my early days when I was a student activist, and I feel active. I mean, activist, and I advocate activism. So the next 10 years, and of course, this is a separate story, but I will also be taking up areas outside of disaster risk reduction, because there are other social problems that I'm interested in and I need to devote time to. But I will continue to be supportive of the theme of, what is my theme? Mars. Mainstreaming adaptation, resilience, and sustainability. It's a badly worded name because it sounds off the planet. Increasingly, I talk of it as MPN, the Mainstreaming Partnership Network. But so I kind of move away from Mars. But I do believe thematically it's important. And I'm not touching on the other themes. I'll mention it to you personally, but I don't want it necessarily propagated. That is, for me, peace building is something that I want to invest more time on, and through interreligious dialogue. So greater interreligious dialogue for its own sake, as well as peace building through interreligious dialogue, is the area which I want to spend some time on in my coming years.